Hello, in this video I want to continue the series that we started talking about Moten and the intellectual property protections resolution. I think that this is a really interesting resolution to have a conversation about the way in which Moten can be used on the affirmative and the negative expansively and not just against like critical teams, which is where I think I see Moten used like the most often. And I think a lot of the critiques that Moten is making about knowledge production and the way that knowledge production becomes like structured by capitalism and colonial extraction have a lot of weight on the question of the WTO and intellectual property protections. And so if you haven't like really thought about this kind of angle on the resolution as before, this is a really good place to start. But I would definitely also watch the intro to Moten and intellectual property protections video, because I think that it does a really good job of explaining a lot of the stuff that I'll kind of be like using as a framework to talk to a lot of the specific arguments here in terms of just like framing what I think your priority should be against policy teams if you really want to make this argument work on the negative, which I think it can be a really good strategy. And I think that it's really advantageous to have an answer to, because I think that if you are trying to learn how to resolve this argument in a debate, I think just going to like a lot of your generic answers that you would read against like Afro-pessimism or black studies in general really might not apply here in the way that you think that they do. And so being able to understand like what are the advantages of like reading a strategy like this is really important for how you sculpt your own strategy, and I think is really important for like how you're able to kind of weigh the pros and cons of whether or not this strategy should be high on your like prep list at all. And so I think just having a full evaluation of that through watching videos like this, no matter what point you're in, can be a really good way to kind of like start your understanding of an angle like this on the resolution. I think when trying to think about just like what are some of the base priorities of like reading Moten against policy teams, I think that what's really important is that you really want to make sure that all of your arguments use a concise type of language that is really able to pull together a really cohesive story from the framing to the thesis question to the alternative, because I think all of the things that happen kind of in between that are able to like fill in on those kind of like three questions, especially if you're able to make them flow really together. If you remember from the last video, I talked a lot about like the question of like policy and planning and its relationship to international organizations such as the WTO, and what the frame of intellectual property protections does is like a form of like subsuming radical alternatives to policy. And so I think there are a lot of ways in which you kind of take this policy and planning framing and use it as a way to like use it against all of the ways in which the affirmative attempts to use like the question of the sustainability of the international economy and use questions of like the impact filters and impact weight, etc., as something against them, as something that proves kind of your arguments about the way in which like planning as a radical method of how we rethink our relationship to like international struggle becomes pushed off by these like larger, more existential questions of like whether or not like humanity will be able to continue or not, which only kind of refocuses a lot of the questions that we were talking about in the last video in terms of like how this kind of like white Western understanding of like what knowledge, invention, and experimentation really look like, which I think is a really interesting place for you to be able to start your criticism, because then you not only have like this what seems like a general indict of the resolution, but something really at the crux of what the plan really can't resolve, because there's like this like symbolic kind of like power to the question of intellectual property protection as a whole that I think that a lot of plan texts really can't deal with. And so forcing them to deal with that and the question of like privatized fill-in for the way in which the plan kind of like reduces the state responsibility and its role in harm definitely does a lot for kind of like centering the debate at the top for something that's really important for you. And then I think as we kind of like talk about advantages to that a little bit later on in the video, the other priority that I think you really want to have is being able to pull like really strong examples of what international struggle looks like in the question of like not only intellectual property protections, but rather what a different kind of relationship to like medical study, to ways of thinking about like healing alternatives, etc., do at an international scale, in the way that it's able to resolve basically the ways in which the government is able to like withdraw its responsibility from being able to engage these questions. And I think that that can like put a lot of weight for the alternative to have like maybe a different kind of solvency threshold than a lot of the other like alternatives that are usually read. And I think that also it can basically turn it into a counterplan with like a different measure for how the judge is thinking about solvency because of this prior framing question that we're having. And so now I think it's like good for us to kind of talk about the ways that you can make these framing arguments extremely strong. I think that at a base level, policy and planning is a really good indict of the way in which like the 1AC and the 2AC will attempt to spin the debate, but I don't think that it doesn't allow you to like by itself win like individual net benefits to why like thinking through planning as the way the judge should view the debate is preferable. And I think that a lot of the arguments that you want to make is that like planning is basically the refusal of ability to be captured by policy. And so it's not even a question of whether or not we can evaluate like whether or not policy is good or bad, but if we we can evaluate whether or not it blocks off radical alternatives to the way in which the world is in the status quo. And therefore it sets up not only a net benefit to like what that evaluation actually looks like that you can act out through the debate, but it also sets it up so that any kind of like trade-off argument you're winning between the way in which the 1AC kind of like ontologizes the current way in which we would live and relate to the world also becomes offense for like why not only the alternative is net better, but also why they can't access things like a permutation, and your offense starts to get built like more layered and layered before you even really get to the specific links to the affirmative, which I think is a really good place to start these strategies, because it makes your framework feel like something that if like you win it on its own, you've already won like a majority of the debate, which is where I feel like is a good time to spend your time, considering where like a lot of these kind of like second affirmative speeches are kind of like jettison a lot of the framework debate in order to spend their time in a lot of other places. And so I think that you can really take advantage of that here. I think that when you're thinking about just like the thesis question of the debate, a lot of like the thesis level framing questions are about like whether or not you can win a connection between the way in which we think about study and like this international system of the WTO, because I feel like what a lot of teams do as responsiveness to like Black studies as a whole in these types of resolutions policy teams is try to like make the critique that the 1AC is making like seem so US centered that it can't really come to grips with the way in which like the complexity of international politics. But I think Moten is a little bit different, and I think that the WTO actually changes the terms of that debate, because the WTO operates as a single entity that like works in the name of several kind of like sovereign nations that are recognized as like economically relevant to like the international well-being of the world. And so I think that like things like that work as like literal like whole governing bodies that kind of structure the way in which individual countries and sovereign actors are supposed to act. And so it's actually a little bit more encompassing, even if obviously the thesis might not go all the way down to like, you know, people make literally X and Y votes based off of like this many things. It does allow you to really tell a historical conjecture the way in which the WTA has participated in like forms of resource extraction through the various ways in which they've kind of like invested in like similar ways of modeling governance in ways that kind of reify like all of the arguments about like total unknowledge and the impacts that produce further marginalization because of those that are like inevitably never represented in like the WTO as a structure. And so I think at a base level you have all of these pieces of offense from the thesis that really like hit the resolution in hard places that plain text can't solve easily, and force like the 1AC to have like some different benefits that it's really able to weigh, as long as you're able to kind of like do some work on like the impact framing and really win a strong debate, which I'll kind of talk about in the next video. Then I think you have a really strong chance to seal a lot of these neg debates in and have a really strong negative strategy. Hopefully this video was helpful, and hopefully it's giving you more context to what I'm thinking about in terms of Moten and intellectual property protections and the way in which Moten and Hardy can be used on this particular resolution for September and October. And yeah, hopefully you'll tune in for more. Thanks.